Hi, welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. We're actually recording this in the evening, so there's always a slight funky feel to the proceedings, and Matt is laughing already. And this is about Think Fast, Talk Smart, because I'm talking to the wonderful host, Matt Abrahams, of that particular globally ranked podcast. Trust me, the tide rises all boats. And I love this particular subject matter because I'm a barrister, and so I've had to talk for a living. But we know, don't we, that public speaking is really a super fear for so many people. In fact, I'm going to be talking to Matt about this. I saw a recent survey that had number one fear of most people, public speaking. It was about 6 places above death. I mean, how does that work? Does that mean if you're asked to write the eulogy, you'd rather be in the box? I don't know. So once again, I need someone far wiser than me. Come back to me just after this.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico. Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.
So it's a big warm welcome to Matt Abrahams to the Leadership Enigma. You're in California, so you are something like 7 or 8 hours behind me, sir, but how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm just getting my day started, Adam. I am so psyched to have a conversation.
It is great because it is now, as I say, the evening here. There's been a podcast before me. There is whiskey on the table just over there, but I'm not partaking in it. I just want you to know that. But thank you so much for taking the time to join me here. And I gave a very, very brief introduction of you, Matt, but would you just tell the listeners and, I would say, also the watchers with our YouTube channel, a little bit about your background, because you are at the wonderful Stanford, but I also, let's give some context in relation to Think Fast, Talk Smart, because it's in the top 1% of podcasts globally. I aspire to such figures, Matt. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first, I only have coffee in my purview. I don't have whiskey, so I'll try to speak a little slower. So I teach at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. I teach also for the Continuing Studies program at Stanford. I've been doing so for almost a decade and a half. I love teaching. Prior to that, I worked in the corporate world. I ran learning and development organizations for software and really saw how important communication is. And I try to bring that into the classes I teach on strategic communication and into the podcast, which is exclusively about helping people to hone and develop their communication. So I really live and breathe this communication stuff, and I look forward to talking about the topic with you.
Tell me a little bit about how Think Fast and Talk Smart started, because I remember very well, the Leadership Enigma started in the pandemic. So it was a panic reaction to lockdown, Matt. So tell me a little bit, how was it born?
Well, it started actually many, many years ago. I was asked by the deans at Stanford's Graduate School of Business to help with a problem our students had.
Okay.
Many of our students, the best and brightest and the young business minds, were struggling in class when the mean, evil professor would call on them and say, "What do you think?"
Right.
The cold call. And they said, "Can you help?" And as a communication guy on campus in the program, they said, "Can you help?" So I created a workshop based on experiences I've had in teaching other courses in the continuing studies program that really focused on helping people feel more comfortable and confident speaking in the moment. And we called the workshop Think Fast, Talk Smart. So several years later, when the university or the business school decided we should try this podcasting thing out. And so they asked me, they figured, the guy who talks about how to reduce anxiety of speaking will probably be not that nervous doing it. And it was an experiment. And we launched January 2020. And if there is any silver lining of the pandemic, is that people started listening to podcasts, and we had several already recorded. We were about communication. People were locked down, trying to figure out how they were going to communicate, and started listening to us. So right place, right time, had some hopefully good content. I'll let you be the judge of that. And ever since then, we've been doing great.
Well, I'm hoping that we could all ride that particular wave. I'm interested, actually. I mean, as a communications expert, I don't know, the odd person might say I'm meant to be as a trained barrister, as a trial advocate, and in the work that I do. Am I an expert? I don't know. But what do you think it is about podcasts at the moment from a communication perspective that is becoming so sticky? Are we riding a wave that will fizzle out, or do you think actually it's here to stay?
Well, first and foremost, I don't know that I'm an expert either. If you just ask my wife, she's very good at showing that I don't always practice what I teach. But I do think podcasts have taken off for a couple reasons. One, you can pick and choose. It gives us a sense of choice in a way that we don't necessarily have in other venues. It also allows us to dive deeper into topics that we're very interested in. And there's something a bit intimate and personal about podcasting. You put in your earbuds or you go for a walk and you're listening with somebody. And I think that really makes a difference. So I'm excited. I listen to lots of podcasts, including yours. I learn a lot, and it's part of my daily routine. And I think many people do the same thing.
Well, I'm delighted that you're a listener. I really am. There's definitely a togetherness, I think, of people who are podcasting, just as there was a show that left the studio as I came in. And we have this common bond. And you mentioned something I want to pick up on because I found this too. So it's kind of one podcaster asking another fellow podcaster. You mentioned the word intimacy, and I want to pick up on that because I found that I am having personal, intimate conversations. And actually, I may have only met the person or chatted to them once, like this, Matt, us doing this episode. But there is a level of intimacy where I almost feel I can connect with you anytime. I can kind of say, hey, Matt, can you help me with something? And you might be able to do that. So thinking about it from a communications perspective, what is it about this podcasting medium that's providing us that level of intimacy or closeness or connection?
Well, for many podcasts like yours, like mine, it's about questioning. It's about sharing information. It's about disclosure. And all of those are techniques for building trust, for building connection, building warmth. And so the medium, at least the way you and I practice it, allow for that connection to happen very quickly. And that brings that feeling of immediacy and intimacy to what we do. And I, like you, really enjoy that. It's a lot of fun. I've made friends out of the people that I've interviewed, and I've gotten to know a lot about a lot of people. And so as a host, it's wonderful. But I also really, really am passionate about teaching and helping others. And this is a great medium to do that in.
So, I agree with you. I think that's why we're all passionate and do what we do. So let's think about Think Fast, Talk Smart. And now I know we'll have a brief conversation, really, but I hope it piques people's interest. I'm going to ask you how they can connect with you and find the podcast and join in the conversation and be part of the community as well. Why is public speaking so feared by so many?
Yeah, it's a ubiquitous fear for sure. Those of us who study it believe that it's part of our human nature. It's part of who we are. When you speak in front of others, you put yourself at risk. You risk your status. And I'm not talking about the status of who drives a fancy car or who has so many followers on social media, but relative to your position in a social hierarchy. And as our species was evolving, your relative status was really important. And if I do something that can lower that status, that could be very risky. It might mean I don't get access to the resources I need. And that carries with us as our species goes on. And so many of us who study this think it's part of who we are. That doesn't mean we can't manage it. We certainly can, but it is part of being human.
And when you're working with your students, and I know you're going to be doing that just after this particular conversation as well, so you're back to the day job, what do you say to your students in relation to its importance for their professional careers, regardless of whether they become an entrepreneur, whether they go into a small, medium-sized business or a large business, especially for their leadership? And I'm not talking about people immediately becoming leaders, but they are still leading self. And they are still building their own personal brand in a business environment. So what do you say to them in relation to the importance of this skill set for their success?
It doesn't take much convincing of people that managing anxiety around speaking is important, because the feeling is it really makes a big impression on us, right? We really have a visceral experience. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is getting people to invest in what it takes to not only manage the anxiety, but to hone and develop their communication. A lot of us feel like, hey, I get by. I'm able to be successful. I'm able to accomplish what I need, so I can communicate well enough. So where it's difficult is to help people really understand that by spending a little bit of time honing your craft, focusing on your communication, that you can actually make a really big impact. And the thing that I find is most helpful in getting people to think this way is two things. One, ask people to think of a time where they watched or witnessed, or maybe it happened to themselves, where an idea that was a really good idea didn't go much beyond the initial stage.
Right.
And what role did communication play? And most people say it was really important. And then the other thing that really helps is I ask people to future cast, to think of their potential future, where they see themselves. And then I just say, how important do you think communication would be in that role? And again, people say very important. So snapping people out of the habits that they're in around their communication is what really helps to get people passionate about working on that skill.
And it may well be that we're a product of our environment and our upbringing as well. And this is an interesting one, because the topic of neurodiversity came up in last week's, and I'm happy to say I'm chronic ADHD. And in some ways, does the issue of neurodiversity ever come up as regards people's almost predisposition to communication? Does that ever come up as a topic now? Because I know businesses are talking about, sometimes the superpower of the neurodiverse and their ability to communicate differently. I don't know. Does it come up in your class?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical. Right. We need to hear from creative, disparate voices, and the neurodiverse are part of that diversity by definition. But neurodiversity, folks who have neurodiversity expertise or challenges, however you want to define that, can be very, very valuable in an organization. And in fact, we need to, and I coach my students to be very open to input from people of lots of different backgrounds. So I think we do better the more inclusive we are of different perspectives, different ways of communicating, different inputs that we get. And as communicators, as leaders, we need to spend some time thinking about how we adjust and adapt our communication to be more relevant and easily taken up by a wide, diverse audience. And
it's really embracing that diversity of thought and experience, isn't it? And I asked that question, it popped into my mind, Matt, because it's something that's really a hot topic for people right now.
Oh,
I want to move on. Let's give the listeners and the watchers some nuggets, I think, and there are so many I can ask you about. Let me start with any top tips in relation to helping people with anxiety for public speaking. Now, I speak for a living, you speak for a living, but we're always going to get that feeling in our stomach, aren't we? I remember talking to a wonderful trial lawyer with many decades in front of judge and jury, dealing with some of the most prominent and high-profile cases in the land. And I said to him, after 40 years of experience, I said, do you still get that knotty feeling or sick feeling before you go into court? And he said to me this, he said, yeah, I do. He said, and the day I don't is the day I need to hang up the wig and the gown. So it perhaps never goes away. Perhaps we control it a little better. But what might be some of your tips for anyone in just controlling the anxiety when they have a big ticket speaking event?
Absolutely. And like you, I still get nervous, even though this is my life's passion. So when it comes to managing anxiety, you really have to take a two-pronged approach. You have to manage sources and manage symptoms. Sources are what generate, initiate, and exacerbate our anxiety, and symptoms are the things that we experience. So For example, in terms of symptomatic relief, taking some deep belly breaths really does make a difference, especially when you have the exhale be slightly longer than the inhale. So the rule of thumb, or what I like to say, the rule of lung, is make sure your exhale is twice as long as your inhale. This can initiate a relaxation response. It slows down the heart rate, slows down the breathing rate, which then slows down your speaking rate. Another thing to do for those of you who are like me, I blush and I perspire when I get nervous. We need to cool our bodies down. We're getting hot. We're pumping more blood through tighter blood vessels. That raises our blood pressure. Holding something cold in the palm of your hand can actually cool you down.
I didn't know
on a cold morning, if you've ever held warm tea or coffee in your hands and felt it warm you up, you can do the same in reverse, and it reduces the perspiration and the blushing. So there are things you can do to manage some of the symptoms, but the sources, the things that initiate and exacerbate, also have to be addressed. Let me share one with you, Adam.
Yeah.
Many of us are made nervous because of the goal we're trying to achieve. You know, for the entrepreneurs I coach, they're afraid they're not going to get their funding. For the students I teach, they're afraid they won't get a good grade. You or others might be afraid that your project might not be supported. In all of those cases, what's making us nervous is a potential negative future outcome. So it's something in the future. So the way to address this anxiety source is to become more present oriented. If I'm in the moment, then it reduces some of that anxiety. So how do you get in the moment? You and I, before we started recording, we were having a bit of chit chat. We were talking. That's a great way. Before you start speaking, have some conversation, get focused. When you're talking to somebody, it's really hard to be worried about what's coming next. Maybe do what athletes do. Listen to a song or a playlist. Do something physical. Walk around the building. You can even do something as simple as start at 100 and count backwards by 17s or 13s. The effort that's involved causes you to be present-oriented. So the bottom line is this. You can manage your anxiety. It takes work, but you have to attack both sources and symptoms to do so.
I love that advice. I was slightly worried then because when you said counting back by 17 and 13, I was thinking my maths is not good enough. That's why I did law math. So I might have to go for the easy one. That is great advice. And what I want to focus on for this episode, if I may, please, is not what we've prepared to say from a public speaking perspective. I want to focus on the off the cuff or dealing with questions, because I know a lot of people are very nervous about what happens when I'm not in control. I'm in control of my presentation, but what happens when the first question comes in or the first intervention comes in or the heckle? I know it's not stand-up, but you know what I mean. Let's talk a little bit about dealing with the off the cuff. So it almost feels natural and seamless and part and parcel of the presentation that you had.
You are absolutely right. And if you think about it, if people do actually do work on their communication, they most often worked on the planned communication, the presentation, the meeting, etc. Yet most of our personal and professional communication is spontaneous. It happens in the moment. Somebody asks a question or asks for your feedback, or you make a faux pas and mistake and you have to correct it. Yeah. All of that is happening in the moment, and that can be very challenging. And so leveraging that work I did many years ago on the Think Fast, Talk Smart workshop I put together.
That's how it started, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so we must take time to think through how to be more comfortable and confident in the spontaneous speaking. And there's a process, a methodology, if you will, that I've come up with. And I'll share a few of the steps.
Please.
The first step is we have to get out of our own way. Many of us actually work against ourselves in that spontaneous moment. We do a lot of judging and evaluating when we communicate. And sometimes that judgment and evaluating can prohibit or prevent us from actually communicating at all. So in a moment when somebody asks me a question, I might start thinking, oh, here's my answer. Oh, that's not a good answer. Maybe I should do it this way. And all of a sudden, I'm not saying anything. So we need to leverage some advice that comes from the world of improvisation. And if you think about it, improv, it is not always designed to be funny. Improv is about being in the moment and speaking. So in improv, when you have a situation that you have to respond to, one of their maxims that I think is wonderful is dare to be dull. Dare to be dull. And what that means is just get it done. Rather than putting all this pressure on ourselves to do it right, to judge, to evaluate, to make sure it's perfect, just get it done. And from a neuroscience point of view, there's actually something to this advice. There's this notion of cognitive load. Think of your brain as a computer. It's not a great analogy because it's not perfect, but your brain has only so much processing power, just like a PC has just so much processing power. If I'm dedicating any of that processing power to evaluating and judging what I'm doing, that means I have less to actually focus on what I'm doing. So if I can convince myself just to get it done, just dare to be dull, I free up those resources that we're judging and evaluating, and it can make a huge difference. So I tell my Stanford MBA students, I have the audacity to tell some of the brightest young business minds to strive for mediocrity.
Right.
And they look shocked. What do you mean? But I follow that up. I say, strive for mediocrity so you can achieve greatness. And the reason here for this advice is when you just get it done, or work to just get it done, you actually have more bandwidth and resources to do it really well. That's the first step. And if we can get out of our own way, that opens us up to the next step, which is structuring our content. When you have to speak, you have two fundamental tasks, what to say and how to say it. If you have structures in mind of how to say it, then you've halved your burden. So for example, many people who do sales are very familiar with the structure problem, solution, benefit. Here's a problem you have. I have a tool, a service, a product that solves that problem. And here's how you're going to be benefiting from that. If I have that structure in my back pocket and I know I have to sell something, all I have to do is plug in my information into the structure. Right. It's like a recipe. If you have all the ingredients and you put them in the recipe, chances are you're going to get a good meal. So how do you speak spontaneously? You get out of your own way, and then you use structure. Those are the two fundamental components.
So I love that in relation to getting out your own way. And somewhere it's actually be kind to yourself, because I think we're always perhaps the critical friend, and sometimes the biggest critic is the internal critic, isn't it? So I love that from the world of improv, dare to be dull. At one point I thought you were going to say the yes and technique that they use, but I love that, striving for mediocrity in order to achieve greatness.
Yes. Yes and is important too. I'm a big fan of yes and, but in terms of getting out of your own way, the big step is dare to be dull.
Well, you'll love we've done one episode with some improv specialists. We've got another one coming up, so you'll love that as well. Let me come back to, you said something which intrigues me. You're working with some of the greatest minds on the planet. Let's be honest, those who are at Stanford doing their MBA, these are bright folk from all over the world. Genuinely, Matt, how are you getting them to accept that? Strive for mediocrity in order to achieve greatness when they've never hit mediocrity probably ever, or it's their biggest fear ever to be mediocre?
Well, so I do so by two ways. One, framing it. So I tell everybody on the first day of my class is like a high school science class. Right. It's all about experimenting. Some are going to blow up and go completely wrong, and others are going to do great. And that's the mentality I want you to take. So we take the judgment, the stress out of it a bit. So one is setting a context where you can feel comfortable experimenting. And then the other is we try it, we do it. So I actually leverage improvisation games that I've learned from some of my colleagues and I've picked up on my own. And in those safe ways, practicing some of these things so that people can begin to see value in a circumstance that isn't high pressure, high stress. And then they begin to convince themselves like, wow, if I took this mindset into a Q&A, it would make things much easier. Or if I applied that when somebody asked me for feedback, I could give them useful feedback in the moment. So it's about setting the context and environment and then giving opportunities for practice that are low stress that seem to work.
Now, every leader, excuse my voice, but every leader in every discipline has got to be able to present, got to be able to communicate, and got to be able to deal with the spontaneous and the off the cuff. I want to pick up on something else that you mentioned there. What is it you do to create that environment of play and safety? Because I think that's so important for a leader anyway. We're talking about now about the culture to experiment and play and maybe be mindful and take risks, but learn. So what are you doing in your class, Matt, that is kind of transferable to any leader when we think about that environment?
Right. And really what we're talking about is psychological safety. How do we create an environment where people feel comfortable bringing their opinions, their vulnerabilities, their personalities to the conversation?
And failing.
I'm sorry?
And failing, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think as leaders, you have to state it, you have to speak it, should be part of your mission, vision, values, but you have to live it. So we as leaders, we as teachers, we have to express our vulnerabilities. We have to share our insecurities. We have to demonstrate that we don't know it all and be open to that feedback. When I was in high tech, I worked for a company, and we had failure Fridays. Every Friday we would come together and people would share the biggest failure they had that week. And in fact, there was a panel of judges who would award the biggest failure.
Celebrate.
You got some cool little prize. And the idea was to say, one, if you're not risks require failure, right? If you're going to take risks, try something new, failure is going to happen. But failure is something that we should embrace. But the reason we shared it publicly is don't make the same mistake again. Let's learn from each other's mistake. So setting up a culture where that happens, where failure is actually part of the learning process, part of the growing process. I like to frame failure. I talk about mistakes. And one way to frame mistakes is like a missed take. In movies and television, they do different takes. Well, that's really what our behavior is. And if something doesn't go right, we missed that take, and now we're going to go do another one. It doesn't mean we're bad, wrong, or we shouldn't keep trying. So really reframing how we approach risk, how we approach failure can help. And as leaders, we need to set that culture, we need to set that example, and we need to reward people who fall in line with what we're talking about. And that's really how you make it happen.
No, I love that, Matt. We've both probably got, work with clients who operate in highly regulated environments where that's just so difficult because of the risk adversity. The second part of the structure you gave was about structure, the second point of the 2-point plan. And it was not just about what to say, but how do you say it? So is this something that a speaker can apply to questions and answers?
You bet.
Right.
You bet. So there are lots of structures for answering questions. I have one that I really like. I'll share the acronym. It's ADD, for adding value, not attention deficit disorder. And it works like this. When somebody asks you a question, you answer the question. That's the A. The first D is you give a detailed example. So you answer the question, immediately follow it with an example that reinforces your response.
Right.
And then finally, the second D is describe relevance or value. So you explain what it means to somebody. So I've tried to answer some of your questions in this structure. You ask me the question, I give you an answer, I give you an example, and then I explain why it is important. So imagine I'm interviewing you for a job, and I might say, Adam, share with me your experience. And you might say something like this. Well, I've been a podcast host for a number of years now. I have hosted podcasts of varying lengths, some video, some audio only. And what this means is if you hire me to be this podcast position, I'm going to come in and know exactly what to do. So you answer the question, you give a concrete example, and then you explain the relevance. That to me is a complete answer. And by knowing that structure, when you ask me a question, all I have to do is think, what's my answer? What's an example? And how is this important to the person I'm talking to? It becomes so much easier.
I love that, Matt, again, because we're adding value to the listeners and the watchers. Yes. And actually that resonates with me because if I think again of my trial lawyer days, judges wanted proposition backed up by evidence and support. So if there was a question being asked by the trial judge, they wanted the answer up front so that they understood that you answered the question and then what was the evidence and support. And in some ways, that reminds me of that, as you're saying, answer the question first.
And what most people do, Adam, is most people are discovering their answer as they are speaking it. And all of a sudden they're rambling and meandering and you're like, what the heck are they saying? So if you remind yourself, I have to answer first clearly and concisely, support that answer and explain the relevance, all of a sudden your answers become concise. When I teach executives all over the world this skill and others, they'll say, thank you so much, not because you helped me answer the question, but because you helped me stop answering the question. And that's so important. Concision and clarity are so important.
I think we see that so often, don't we? Maybe from the people who run countries are unlikely sometimes to answer the question and ramble on. And we have to just go along with the journey and say at some point they will answer the question. But let me ask you this. How can people connect with you, Matt? And how can they find your amazing podcast? Because we are just touching the surface here. And I know that there's lots of episodes on lots of topics. Tell us, how can listeners and watchers get in touch?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. So Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast is on every podcatcher out there, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, YouTube. You can find us wherever you find podcasts.
Great.
I'm a big user of LinkedIn and Instagram. Feel free to link into the Think Fast, Talk Smart Instagram and LinkedIn page. Also, I host a website, curate a website called nofreakingspeaking.com. And that's a great place to learn new skills and to connect with me. Thank you for the opportunity to share that information. I look forward to helping people hone and develop their communication.
It's our pleasure, Matt. It really is. And we'll actually put all of that in the show notes as well so that people can readily find those, which is fine. Let me ask you this question. What would be your number one tip for anyone in relation to communication skills who is finding themselves in a leadership role, whether they're leading one or two people or whether they're leading an enormous global organization? We know it's important communication. This is probably a silly question, isn't it, Matt? But is there kind of a number one top tip that you'd like to share?
The number one mistake people make in their communication is they start from the wrong place. They start by saying, here is what I want to say. Right. And that is exactly the wrong place to start. Instead, you need to think about, what does my audience need to hear? You must focus on the audience and their needs rather than what you want. So you need to understand, what knowledge level do they have on the topic I'm speaking about? What are their attitudes towards it? What are their areas of resistance? And that will help you shape your communication. If I can make my messages resonate, be relevant and salient for you, you're going to pay attention, because let's face it, attention is the most precious commodity in the world today. And if I don't tailor and hone my message for you, you're not going to pay attention to it. So the number one bit of advice, focus on your audience and their needs, craft your communication to be in alignment with that.
Matt, you've been an absolute superstar. Thank you so much for finding the time to come and chat to me on the Leadership Enigma. I know you've got to rush off and teach an MBA class in a moment anyway. So it's a huge thank you. I hope this has been fun for you too.
It has been a lot of fun. Thank you. I hope people take value. I hope you enjoy some of that whiskey. I'm going to go have another sip of coffee.
You're a gent. Take great care. Bye now.